The sun had barely risen when he stepped out of his small, tidy house and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, with the occasional sound of a distant car or birds chirping in the trees. Everything seemed calm, peaceful, normal. He had lived in this neighborhood for several years, and to anyone passing by he looked like just another ordinary man, living an ordinary life. His neighbors might wave politely or nod when they saw him, but they didn't know much about him. They had no idea that behind his calm, everyday exterior, he carried skills and experiences that few could even imagine. He went about his morning routine with precision. Every movement was deliberate. He jogged around the block, his steps measured, his breathing steady. The streets were empty at this hour, which he liked. It gave him time to think and focus, to clear his mind for the day ahead. He returned home, stepped into the shower, and then prepared breakfast. Simple, healthy food. He believed in taking care of his body because it was the one tool that had saved his life many times before. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, and then tidied the kitchen. Everything had its place and everything was in order. As he went about his day, he paid close attention to his surroundings. The neighborhood was not dangerous, not really, but there was tension. In recent months, a local gang had begun causing trouble. They didn't like people who were different, and they had a history of harassing minority families. His neighbors whispered about them sometimes, worried about what might happen. Some had even left, unwilling to face the growing hostility, but he stayed. He didn't let fear decide his life. He had learned long ago that preparation and awareness were more valuable than panic. People saw him as calm and unassuming. He worked a regular job, mostly sitting behind a desk, helping people with routine matters. It was quiet, predictable, and he liked that. He didn't crave attention or recognition. In the office, he was polite, reserved, and helpful. Nobody would have guessed the strength and discipline hidden beneath his ordinary appearance. It wasn't arrogance that kept him quiet. It was habit, and a sense of humility that had been ingrained in him over years of training. He knew that true power did not need to be shown. It only needed to be ready when called upon. Despite the quiet of his life, there were small reminders that the world outside was not always kind. He noticed broken bottles along the street, graffiti on nearby walls, and the occasional hostile glance from strangers. The gang had started leaving warnings, subtle messages to intimidate the people around. Some neighbors had called the police, but the gang was clever and careful. They knew how to avoid direct consequences. Most people were afraid to confront them. But he didn't fear them. He watched, observed, and learned their patterns, just as he had been trained to do in a life that seemed far away from this ordinary neighborhood. He wasn't oblivious to human behavior either. He noticed how fear could change people. Some of his neighbors walked faster when the gang was nearby. Some avoided looking anyone in the eye. Children stayed indoors, their laughter replaced by cautious whispers. He felt a mixture of sadness and determination. It wasn't just about his own safety. It was about the quiet dignity of his community, about standing firm when others felt powerless. He didn't speak much of this to anyone. Words were not necessary. His actions, when needed, would speak louder. Every evening after work, he followed another routine. He would exercise in his small backyard, a private corner of his world where he could test his strength, his endurance, his reflexes. No one ever saw him doing push-ups, pull-ups, or practicing movements that seemed almost like a dance of precision and control. He didn't need anyone to watch or approve. These exercises were a reminder of his capabilities, a connection to the life he had led before. They were a silent promise to himself that he would never be caught unprepared, no matter what threats came knocking. Despite all the discipline, he was not cold or unfeeling. He cared deeply about his neighbors, about the little community that had grown around him. He smiled when he saw the elderly man watering his garden or the mother guiding her child to school. He helped quietly when he could, lifting heavy boxes, fixing a broken fence, giving advice when asked. People appreciated him, though most didn't understand the depth of his presence. There was a sense of calm reassurance that followed him, a quiet strength that people felt even if they couldn't define it. Evenings were also a time for reflection. He would sit on his porch, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky would turn soft shades of orange and pink, and he would think about the path that had brought him here. He remembered the discipline, the training, the experiences that shaped him into someone capable of extraordinary things. But he also remembered the lessons that life had taught him outside of the military, the importance of patience, observation, and empathy. It wasn't enough to be strong. One had to be wise, measured, and deliberate. He had friends, though few knew the real depth of his past. They liked his company because he was calm, reliable, and thoughtful. They didn't know that beneath his quiet demeanor was a history of facing danger head-on, surviving situations that most people could never imagine. They didn't know that every routine he followed, every exercise, every careful glance at his surroundings, was rooted in a lifetime of preparation. But he didn't need them to know. The life he led now was a balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, a blend that allowed him to live in peace without hiding his readiness to act if needed. Even with all the preparation, he valued normalcy. He loved simple pleasures, reading a book in the afternoon, listening to music while cooking, tending to his small garden. These moments grounded him, reminded him of what he was protecting. Life could be disrupted in an instant, but for now there was calm. And in that calm he found strength, focus, and clarity. The ordinary routines of his life were not a weakness. They were the foundation upon which he could respond to danger with precision and control. But he knew that danger was never far away. The gang in the neighborhood was a growing threat. He had watched them from a distance, noting their movements, their habits, and their targets. They were reckless, cruel, and unaware of what they were about to face. While others panicked or avoided confrontation, he planned silently. He understood that true power did not come from anger, but from control, from patience, and from knowing when and how to act. Every detail mattered. Every observation mattered. And he had spent years perfecting that skill. As he finished his evening routine, he felt a sense of readiness. It wasn't a readiness born from fear. It was readiness born from discipline, from experience, from understanding that the world could be unpredictable. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and he didn't need recognition. He simply knew that if the moment came, he would be ready. And that knowledge, quiet and unassuming as it was, gave him a sense of calm that few could understand. The ordinary life he led was a mask, but it was also a choice, a way to live with dignity, strength, and awareness. The streetlights flickered on as night fell, casting long shadows across the pavement. He stood on his porch for a few moments, watching the darkness settle in. Somewhere in the distance he heard laughter and footsteps, sounds of people living their own lives. He smiled faintly, a private smile not directed at anyone. Life could be cruel, people could be unfair, but he had learned to navigate both. He had learned to move with purpose, to observe without bias, and to act when necessary. And while the night was quiet now, he knew that the world had a way of testing even the calmest lives. Inside his home, he prepared for bed. Every item was in its place, every tool and object where it belonged. He checked locks, adjusted lights, and took one last look at his surroundings. It was a small ritual, almost meditative. It reminded him that he controlled what he could, observed what he couldn't, and respected both. As he lay down, his mind was clear, focused, and ready. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own uncertainties, but he was prepared to meet them. Not with fear, but with calm, measured action. That was who he was, and that was what allowed him to live in peace, even in a world that could be harsh and unpredictable. And so, in the quiet of the night, he slept. Not because he was naive or unaware of the dangers around him, but because he had mastered the art of balance. The ordinary life, the routines, the small acts of kindness, the quiet observation, all of it was part of a life lived fully, prepared for anything. He was calm, he was ready, and he was strong. Unbeknownst to the neighborhood, behind the ordinary facade was a man whose past had forged him into someone few could ever hope to challenge. A man whose life was about to intersect with the chaos that had been creeping ever closer to his doorstep. The next day started like any other. The sun rose slowly, spilling golden light across the quiet street. He followed his usual routine, jogging around the block, checking his surroundings, and taking note of the usual signs. The broken fence 2 houses down, the faded graffiti on the corner wall, the distant hum of a car passing by. Everything seemed ordinary, but beneath the surface he could sense a tension in the air. Something had changed overnight, though he couldn't immediately place it. The neighborhood, usually calm in the early morning, felt slightly heavier, almost expectant. He returned home, sweat cooling on his skin, and went through his usual exercises in the small backyard. Push-ups, pull-ups, stretches, each movement precise, each repetition purposeful. He wasn't doing this for show or for health alone. It was a way of preparing himself for anything that might come. Life had taught him that danger could strike when least expected, and he always stayed ready. Later that morning, as he was washing dishes, a sudden sound shattered the calm, a loud crash from the front of his house. He froze for a moment, listening intently. Another crash followed, then laughter, crude and aggressive, echoing down the street. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. Instead, he calmly wiped his hands, glanced out the window, and saw them. A group of men, rough, loud, and unmistakably part of the gang that had been terrorizing the neighborhood, were at his front yard. They kicked at the door, slashed at the mailbox, and threw garbage across the walkway. Graffiti had already begun to appear on his walls. Hateful symbols and threatening words, a message meant to intimidate. His house, his sanctuary, was being violated in front of his eyes. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering to each other, frozen between fear and curiosity. Some reached for their phones to call the police. The gang laughed at their hesitation, their arrogance growing with each passing moment. They had no idea who lived here, no idea of the life that had prepared him for this moment. He watched quietly, studying their behavior. Their movements were sloppy, their patterns predictable. Some of them paused to mock the house. Others exchanged crude jokes. Every action, every step revealed a weakness. He didn't need to rush or confront them directly. Observation was his strength. Patience was his weapon, and he had more than enough of both. Inside, he went about a simple preparation. He didn't arm himself with guns or weapons. That wasn't necessary. His body, his mind, and the skills honed over years of intense training were enough. He moved quietly, checking locks and closing windows, making small adjustments to protect what he could. It wasn't about fighting blindly. It was about control, about strategy, about being ready for whatever came next. The gang continued their rampage. They broke a window, stepped inside briefly, and threw furniture around. He could hear the crashing of glass, the shuffle of boots on the floor, and the careless laughter that came with ignorance. They were focused on destruction, not understanding the consequences of underestimating someone. They didn't realize that behind this calm, ordinary man was a lifetime of discipline, precision, and training. Neighbors were still watching, some frozen in fear, some whispering frantically among themselves. A few children peeked through curtains, their eyes wide, scared, unsure what to do. He kept himself in view of the windows, but calm, collected. There was no shouting, no visible anger. Only the silent calculation of someone who had faced far worse situations before. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, the gang finally left, laughing and taunting, confident that they had sent a message. They didn't notice the small changes he had made while they ransacked the house. The locks had been reinforced subtly, the back exit secured, and the pathways around the property checked for traps. To them, it looked like chaos had won, but it hadn't. He stepped outside to assess the damage once the gang had disappeared around the corner. Windows were broken, the front yard was a mess, graffiti marked the walls, and some personal items were missing. But as he looked closer, his expression was calm, even thoughtful. The destruction did not scare him. It did not shake him. He knew exactly what to do next, how to respond, and when. Neighbors approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" one asked, voice trembling. Others nodded in agreement, expecting to see fear, anger, or despair. Instead, he simply nodded back, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm fine," he said. "We'll handle this." His tone was calm, almost soothing, and it reminded them that not all strength needs to shout. Inside, he started cleaning and repairing, moving efficiently, silently planning. But he also allowed himself a moment to feel what had happened. There was a quiet anger, yes, a human reaction to the violation of his home, but it was controlled. He didn't let it dictate his actions. Instead, he used it to fuel his focus. Every memory, every lesson from his past came to the forefront. He remembered the importance of observation, patience, and strategy. He knew that rushing in blindly would only give the gang an advantage. He also thought about the children, the neighbors, and the sense of community that had been threatened. It wasn't just his home. They had attacked a sense of safety, a feeling of normal life that everyone in the neighborhood deserved. That realization steeled his resolve. His response wouldn't just be for himself, it would be for the people around him who couldn't defend themselves. Throughout the day, he surveyed the area around his house. He noted the escape routes the gang had taken, the patterns of movement, and even small details, the direction of footprints, scuff marks on the ground, and the sounds of vehicles. Everything mattered. Everything told a story.
He didn't need to react violently.
He needed to understand, to plan, to ensure that the gang's next move would be anticipated and countered. Neighbors came by, timidly offering help or expressing concern. He accepted small gestures, smiled politely, but kept the larger plan to himself. They didn't need to know the full extent of his abilities. For now, reassurance was enough. The quiet confidence he displayed helped calm their fears, though they remained unaware of the storm that was quietly building in him. Evening arrived, and he sat on his porch, looking at the damage in the fading light. He didn't rush to clean everything at once. Some repairs could wait. For now, he focused on understanding the incident, analyzing it like he had analyzed far more dangerous situations in his past. The gang had underestimated him. That would be their mistake. He allowed himself a brief reflection. In the past, he had faced far greater threats, life or death situations, impossible odds, moments where hesitation could cost everything. And yet here he was, calm, alive, and ready. The destruction of his house was significant, but it was also a signal that action was needed, that patience must end and careful planning must begin. Night came, and the streets grew silent again. The gang had retreated, but the tension remained. He made small adjustments inside, reinforced weak points, and created mental maps of the neighborhood and escape routes. He thought about possible scenarios and outcomes, ensuring that every decision would be calculated. This wasn't about vengeance for the sake of anger. It was about restoring balance, protecting himself, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The quiet of the night allowed him to focus, and he went to bed knowing that tomorrow would be different. The ordinary life he had been living was now disrupted but not destroyed. The gang had revealed themselves, and now he would reveal a response that they could never have anticipated. Calm, precise, and prepared, he allowed himself a few hours of rest. Sleep was necessary for clarity and strength. The days ahead would require both. Inside his mind, he replayed every detail of the day, the gang's movements, their mistakes, their arrogance. He thought about how easily they could have avoided detection, how predictable they were despite their attempt to intimidate. Each memory strengthened his resolve. By morning, he would begin turning observation into action, planning a response that was not reckless but calculated, precise and effective. Even as he closed his eyes, he allowed himself a small, quiet satisfaction. He was ready. The gang had tested him, but they had no idea the kind of man they were dealing with. For years he had lived quietly, blending in, observing, preparing. Now the moment had come where his patience, skill, and discipline would be needed. The ordinary man that neighbors saw was not powerless. Far from it, and in the quiet of the night he knew that the next chapter was about to begin. The calm exterior remained, but inside, a storm of strategy, focus, and preparedness was quietly forming. He had survived worse. He had trained for worse, and now, he would face this challenge with the same composure and calculated precision that had defined his life for years. The gang had no idea what was coming, and that would be their biggest mistake. After the gang left, a quiet settled over the neighborhood, but he didn't feel calm. Not in the usual way. He sat alone in his living room looking at the mess, thinking about the day's events. The broken windows, the scattered furniture, and the graffiti all told a story. But the story wasn't complete yet. He needed to remember, to reflect, to understand exactly what had happened and why. As he leaned back in his chair, memories began to surface. Memories he had long kept tucked away. Memories that most people would never imagine. Years ago, before this quiet life, before the simple routines and careful observation, he had lived a very different life, a life of extreme discipline, danger, and responsibility. He had been part of an elite military unit, trained to handle situations most people could not even imagine. Every skill he had now, every instinct, every moment of calm came from that past. He remembered the first day of training vividly. The instructors had pushed them to the limit, physically and mentally. There had been fear, doubt, and pain, but also moments of clarity and strength. Every obstacle, every grueling exercise had been designed to strip away hesitation, leaving only precision and confidence. It had been brutal, exhausting, and relentless, but he had survived. More than that, he had excelled. The discipline learned then had become part of who he was, even if the world now saw only an ordinary man. He remembered missions in foreign lands, situations where lives hung in the balance, where split-second decisions could mean life or death. There had been moments of incredible risk, moments where failure was not an option. In those times, he had relied on his training, his observation, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. Every action had been calculated, every movement intentional, and those lessons etched deeply into his mind were still with him now. Sitting in his living room, surrounded by the damage the gang had caused, he could almost see the past blending with the present. The chaos outside his window was minor compared to what he had faced before, but the principles were the same. Observe, analyze, and act with precision. His mind began to plan quietly but deliberately. He didn't rush into anger. He didn't scream or lash out. Instead, he started mapping out what needed to happen next. He went through the details of the gang's attack in his mind. Who had been there, what they had done, how they had moved, and what their weaknesses were. He noticed things others might miss. A scuff on the ground that suggested someone had tripped. The way one of them held a spray can in a careless grip. The way they communicated with each other in short, loud bursts. Every small observation mattered. Every detail could be used. The more he analyzed, the clearer it became. The gang was reckless. They had no real plan. They acted out of arrogance and ignorance, thinking they could intimidate anyone. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That ignorance, combined with their own recklessness, was their greatest weakness, and he intended to use it. Even as he planned, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The life he had now was quiet, peaceful, and ordinary, but it had its own value. It was worth protecting, not just for himself, but for the neighbors who trusted the safety of their streets. The children who played in the yards, the elderly couple who walked slowly down the sidewalk, the families who slept soundly at night. They all deserved to feel safe. And if that meant using the skills he had spent years mastering, then he was prepared to do so. He began to gather information discreetly. He walked through his neighborhood during the day, pretending to follow normal routines but always observing. He noted the gang's hangouts, their patterns, and the times they were most active. He watched from a distance, careful not to be seen, careful not to reveal his knowledge. It wasn't about confrontation yet. It was about preparation, about understanding the situation fully before taking action. Inside his home, he started organizing. He repaired the broken windows and secured the doors, making sure that his house was as safe as it could be. But more than physical safety, he prepared mentally. He went over scenarios, imagining every possible move the gang could make and how he would respond. He trained his mind as much as his body, rehearsing decisions, calculating outcomes, and ensuring that his actions would be precise and effective. Late at night, he would sometimes sit quietly on his porch, looking at the street, replaying memories of his past missions. He remembered the importance of patience, the power of observation, and the value of remaining calm when others were panicked. He also remembered the moral code he had always lived by. Strength was not for intimidation or recklessness, but for protection and justice. That code guided every thought and every decision. He also thought about the emotional side of all this. Anger, yes, was natural, but it had to be controlled. Fear could not be allowed to dictate actions. Compassion, strategy, and discipline were stronger than any rage. He felt a quiet fire within him. Not destructive, but focused, like a laser. It was this fire that allowed him to plan, to anticipate, and to act with precision when the time came. As the days passed, the gang continued their presence in the neighborhood, though they did not directly target him again, for now. They were confident, thinking their first attack had sent the right message. They had no idea that the man they had terrorized was quietly studying them, preparing for the moment when their recklessness would meet calculated consequences. He also reached out in small ways to the neighbors, offering reassurance, helping with minor repairs, and quietly observing their reactions. He wanted them to feel safe even if they didn't understand why he remained calm. His presence, quiet and steady, was meant to stabilize the environment until the situation could be resolved. People could sense that something had changed, though they couldn't put a finger on it. The ordinary man they had known was now quietly preparing for something extraordinary. At home, he began to practice again, focusing on agility, reflexes, and mental acuity. Every small movement mattered. Every exercise, every stretch, every repetition was about readiness. He moved with precision, visualizing potential confrontations, imagining how each decision could affect outcomes. It was not about violence for its own sake, but about control, strategy, and preparedness. He knew that when the time came, hesitation could cost everything. He also spent time reflecting on his own motivations. Revenge was not the goal. Protection was. Justice was. He wanted to ensure that the neighborhood, his home, and the lives of those around him would remain safe. His past had taught him that power without purpose was wasted, and he had a clear purpose now: to ensure that the gang could no longer terrorize anyone without consequence. One evening, as the sun set behind the houses, he took a long walk. The streets were quiet, shadows stretching across the pavement. He imagined possible encounters, anticipating the gang's movements and reactions. He observed small details: footprints in the dirt, marks on the walls, signs of previous attacks. Every observation was a piece of a larger puzzle. By the time he returned home, he had formulated several plans, each detailed, precise, and carefully considered. At night, he reflected further on his past. He remembered missions that required patience, missions that required stealth, missions that demanded both physical and mental endurance. Those memories were not just recollections, they were lessons. Lessons in observation, strategy, and control. They reminded him that even in the chaos of the present, clarity and patience could turn the situation in his favor. The damage to his house remained, a reminder of the threat, but he did not feel fear. He felt readiness. He felt control. And he felt determination. The gang had crossed a line, but he was prepared to respond, not with reckless anger, but with calculated action. The next steps would be precise, deliberate, and effective. As he lay in bed that night, he knew the situation had changed. His quiet, ordinary life had been disrupted, and the time for passive observation was nearing its end. The gang's arrogance had revealed weaknesses. His past had prepared him for this exact type of challenge, and he was ready. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and strategically. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a few moments of rest, knowing that tomorrow he would begin the next phase. The calm, ordinary man the neighborhood knew would soon reveal a side that they could never have imagined. But for now he rested, confident, disciplined, and patient. The storm that had come to his doorstep would meet a force far greater than it had anticipated. And in the quiet of the night, he allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. He was ready. The gang had unknowingly awakened the skills, discipline, and strategy of a man who had been trained for far worse. They had no idea who they had challenged, and when the time came, he would act, not recklessly, but with precision, intelligence, and control. The neighborhood, his home, and those who could not defend themselves would be protected, and that protection, quietly prepared and patiently planned, would make all the difference. The next morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose. The quiet routine he had followed for years was now interwoven with a mission. Today, the day-to-day life he had carefully maintained would intersect with the skills he had spent years perfecting. He didn't feel anger in the reckless sense, but a focused determination. The gang had shown their hand, revealing their arrogance and carelessness. And now it was time for him to respond, not for revenge, but for justice, protection, and restoration of peace. He began by reviewing his observations again. Each member of the gang had patterns, habits, and weaknesses. Some walked the same route to their hangouts. Others made phone calls at predictable times, and a few left obvious signs when they were careless. To an ordinary person, these might seem like trivial details. To him, they were valuable pieces of information. Each piece could be used strategically. He studied the neighborhood from different angles, walking slowly, listening intently, noting small signs others would have overlooked. He felt like a chess player, planning several moves ahead, preparing for contingencies. The first step was subtle but important, gathering information without revealing his intentions. He needed to know where the gang members spent their time when they were away from the street, what they carried, and who might be aiding them. He followed at a distance one afternoon, blending into the background, observing their habits. They had no suspicion. Their confidence made them sloppy. One of them dropped a wallet near a convenience store. Another argued loudly on the phone, revealing plans for later in the week. Each mistake added to the knowledge he collected, creating a mental map of vulnerabilities he could exploit. Back at home, he organized tools, supplies, and even small household items. He didn't see this as preparing for violence, but for control and safety. He rearranged furniture, cleared pathways, and made sure there were no weaknesses in the structure of his home. Everything he did had a purpose. Every movement was deliberate. Even the way he moved around the house, checking windows, doors, and exits, reflected years of training and discipline. He understood that preparation was as much a mental exercise as a physical one. Later in the evening, he observed the gang from a distance again. They gathered near a local park, laughing loudly, completely unaware that someone was watching every move. He noticed the hierarchy in the group, who took charge, who followed, and who seemed less confident. He watched their interactions, noting their distractions and mistakes. It was fascinating in a way, how human behavior could be predictable when observed carefully. The gang was reckless, arrogant, and blind to the consequences of their actions. Their mistakes had set the stage for what was about to happen. He also spent time reinforcing his own mindset. He visualized possible encounters, imagining how each member might react if confronted. He considered every angle, every escape route, and every potential challenge. He repeated scenarios in his mind, rehearsing decisions, refining timing, and ensuring precision. It was not about hatred or personal vendetta. It was about readiness, about maintaining control, and about protecting the innocent. That clarity gave him confidence. He was calm, but he was far from powerless. The first practical step came quietly. One gang member had a habit of leaving his bike unlocked near a corner store. That small carelessness became an opportunity. He moved discreetly, retrieving the bike without confrontation, leaving subtle marks that would create doubt and confusion among the group. They would notice it later, but by then they would begin to question their own security. It was a small move, but it established a psychological edge. The gang would start realizing that their actions had consequences, even if they couldn't yet see who was responsible. He didn't act impulsively. Each move was calculated. Another member of the gang often parked recklessly, leaving the vehicle exposed. He noted patterns of when it was parked and what routes were most frequently used. By observing quietly, he began planning a way to disrupt their confidence without creating unnecessary risk. The goal was not to escalate violence, but to send a clear message. Carelessness had a price, and no one could operate with impunity in the neighborhood. His neighbors still had no idea what was happening. They saw him tending his garden, jogging, and performing small repairs, just as he always had. To them, he was the same calm, ordinary man they had known. That perception was essential. If the gang suspected someone was watching or planning, their arrogance might turn into suspicion. But for now, the ordinary facade protected him. Observation and discretion were as important as any physical preparation. By nightfall, subtle shifts had started. The gang began to notice small things missing, small signs of interference. A door left slightly open, a personal item misplaced, small scratches on their possessions. They laughed at first, blaming each other, but the seeds of unease were planted. Confidence began to erode. They didn't know who was responsible, but instinctively something felt different. Inside, he reviewed every detail once more. The mental map of the gang's habits, routines, and weaknesses was nearly complete. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not from malice, but from knowing that preparation and discipline were beginning to work. The chaos they had created would meet a response that was precise, calculated, and controlled. He understood fully the power of patience. Action, when rushed, could lead to mistakes. Waiting, observing, and preparing ensured success with minimal risk. The next step required direct intervention, but still without unnecessary violence. One evening, he noticed a gang member attempting to intimidate a neighbor, throwing trash and shouting. The man paused, expecting to provoke fear. Instead, the streetlight caught a glimpse of him standing nearby, calm, alert, and unshaken. The gang member hesitated, confused by the quiet authority in his presence. It was subtle, but it created doubt. Confidence wavered when they realized that not everyone could be frightened. That single interaction, small and controlled, shifted the dynamic. He continued building pressure slowly, carefully, using psychological strategies as much as physical readiness. The gang began to miscommunicate, second-guess, and argue among themselves. Their mistakes increased. They left doors unlocked, items unattended, and became increasingly reckless. Each small advantage he gained was a step closer to restoring peace. One night, he left a note in a place they frequented, not threatening, not aggressive, just enough to suggest that someone was watching. Prepared and aware, the effect was immediate. The gang members glanced over their shoulders, whispered nervously, and their laughter became hesitant. They had no idea who was orchestrating the disruption, but instinctively they felt vulnerable. That vulnerability gave him leverage. At home, he continued to refine his plans. He reinforced weak points in his property, rehearsed movements, and visualized every possible scenario. He didn't need weapons because his skill, awareness, and strategy were more effective than anything a weapon could provide. The quiet confidence he maintained became a shield. It wasn't about confrontation for its own sake. It was about control, precision, and justice. The gang's mistakes became more frequent. One tried to follow him to observe his routines, but he noticed immediately, adjusted his path, and created small traps of awareness, obstacles that forced the intruder to reveal more of himself than intended. Another left a door unlocked, which he subtly noticed and corrected, reinforcing the lesson that carelessness had consequences. The pattern was clear. The gang's arrogance was their weakness, and he was exploiting it with calculated intelligence. Neighbors began noticing changes too, though they didn't understand why. The harassment, once constant, became sporadic. Confidence among the gang members visibly decreased. Subtle psychological pressure, combined with careful preparation, was turning the tide. They didn't yet know who was responsible, but the unseen presence of someone prepared, disciplined, and intelligent was shifting the balance. He never acted recklessly or out of anger. Every movement was controlled, every decision considered. He understood fully that discipline and patience would achieve far more than aggression. By the end of the week, the gang had begun to fracture under their own mistakes, suspicion, and the constant silent observation of someone they had underestimated. One evening, as he looked out across the quiet street, he reflected on how much preparation mattered. The neighborhood's safety, his home, and the dignity of those around him had been preserved not through chaos but through careful planning, observation, and strategy. The gang's recklessness had met a response far beyond what they anticipated, not explosive or violent, but precise, methodical, and effective. And yet he knew the work wasn't over. Each small victory had brought him closer to restoring peace completely. The gang would not recover quickly. Their mistakes, arrogance, and underestimation of him had created a chain of consequences that would continue to unfold. He remained patient, alert, and disciplined, ensuring that every step reinforced the safety and dignity of the neighborhood. In the quiet of his home that night, he allowed himself a small sense of accomplishment, not pride but satisfaction. The calm, ordinary life he had led had intersected with his extraordinary skills, and the results were clear. The gang, once a looming threat, was now uncertain, confused, and vulnerable. Preparation, patience, and careful observation had won the first major victories. And as he lay down to rest, he knew the final steps were coming. The gang had revealed themselves, shown their arrogance, and exposed weaknesses. The next phase would bring resolution, but it would be controlled, precise, and deliberate. The neighborhood, his home, and the people he cared about would finally be safe. And that safety, quietly won through discipline and intelligence, would stand as proof that preparation, patience, and calm could triumph over chaos and recklessness. The sun rose slowly over the quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows across the streets. For the first time in days, there was a sense of calm, but it was the kind of calm that hinted at change. He stepped out of his house, moving with the same quiet discipline that had carried him through the chaos of the past week. His mind was sharp, focused, and ready. Today would be the day when the final steps were taken to restore peace to the neighborhood, to his home, and to the lives of those who had lived in fear. He began his morning by walking the streets, casually observing, blending into the scenery, but fully aware of every detail. The gang members were still present, but they were cautious now, uncertain and distracted by the subtle consequences of their previous actions. They hadn't realized who had been quietly monitoring them. But their errors had been documented, their habits noted, and their weaknesses mapped. Each small mistake they had made was now a tool in his hands. As he moved, he noticed one of the gang members lingering near a corner store, seemingly waiting for someone. He paused a few blocks away, observing quietly. The man was impatient, shifting from foot to foot, glancing nervously over his shoulder. It was clear that the subtle pressures of the past week had begun to affect him. His confidence had eroded, replaced with unease. This was the moment when control was most important. Calm, calculated, and patient, he continued observing, making note of every movement. Back at home, he prepared for the next phase. He arranged pathways, checked exits, and mentally rehearsed the steps he would take. He didn't need weapons. His skills, precision, and intelligence were more than enough. He understood fully that true strength did not rely on force alone, but on preparation, patience, and timing. Every detail mattered. Every movement was deliberate. His life had trained him for moments like this, and he had never been more ready. The gang began to make mistakes again, this time more obvious. One of them left a bike unattended near the park. Another argued loudly in a public place, and yet another tripped over a misplaced object. Each mistake was noted, each weakness catalogued. Their confidence had been shaken by the subtle interventions of the past days, and now their recklessness was becoming more apparent. It was clear that they underestimated the man they had harassed. He took action carefully, subtly, and deliberately. One by one, he disrupted their movements without direct confrontation. A door left unlocked was subtly secured in a way that revealed oversight. A bike left near the street was moved in a controlled manner that caused confusion. Phone messages and miscommunications were anticipated and leveraged. Each small act increased their uncertainty, and their sense of safety crumbled. It was not chaos he created, it was clarity. The gang's arrogance was their own undoing, and he was using it to restore balance. By midday, the gang was fragmented. Confusion, mistrust, and frustration had begun to set in. Members argued quietly among themselves, whispering about what had happened, unsure who had been responsible. Their confidence, once loud and brash, had dwindled. The subtle, methodical pressure applied over the past days had begun to dismantle the group without violence. Observation, patience, and precision were proving more powerful than recklessness and aggression. He moved quietly through the neighborhood, reinforcing security and observation points. The neighbors, still unaware of the full story, began to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The harassment that had seemed constant was now irregular. Confidence had returned to those who had felt fear. Children played more freely, and the elderly walked without hesitation. Safety was slowly returning, though the reasons were still unseen. Late afternoon brought a decisive moment. One gang member attempted to intimidate a neighbor again, throwing trash and shouting. This time the reaction was different. He appeared calmly in the street, fully visible, steady, and unshaken. The gang member froze, caught between defiance and uncertainty. The presence of someone confident, precise, and prepared changed the dynamic instantly. Words were not necessary. Authority and readiness spoke clearly. The gang began to retreat slowly, confusion and fear replacing their previous arrogance. They realized, finally, that the quiet, ordinary man they had targeted was anything but ordinary. They had underestimated him completely. Each step of their retreat was cautious, calculated, and hesitant. They had no idea who had orchestrated the disruption, but instinctively they knew their position was compromised. At home, he checked once more. Windows were secured, exits reinforced, and pathways clear. Each detail reflected the same careful precision he had applied throughout the past week. Preparation, observation, and patience had dismantled the gang's power without reckless violence. He reflected on the lessons embedded in the experience. True strength was measured not by fear imposed, but by protection ensured, by intelligence applied, and by patience maintained. By evening, the neighborhood had returned to a sense of peace. The gang had vanished, leaving behind only whispers of confusion and frustration. Neighbors emerged cautiously from their homes, noticing the absence of threat, the subtle restoration of order. Some offered polite nods, smiles, and words of gratitude, though none could comprehend fully the quiet force that had restored their safety. He walked slowly through the streets, observing the small signs of recovery. Broken fences were repaired, doors resecured, and the air itself seemed lighter. The children laughed again, the elderly smiled, and neighbors spoke more freely. A sense of normalcy returned, though the quiet vigilance remained. He knew that life would continue, and that vigilance was always necessary, but for now the immediate threat had been neutralized. As night fell, he sat on his porch reflecting on the week's events. The gang had tested him, challenged his patience, and disrupted his quiet life, but they had revealed their own weaknesses in the process. Observation, preparation, and intelligence had won where chaos and arrogance had failed. He allowed himself a quiet smile, not out of pride but from satisfaction that balance had been restored. Peace had returned quietly and effectively. The neighbors, still unaware of the true events, began to speak of a change. Some said the gang had moved on. Others speculated about why the neighborhood felt safer. They had no idea of the skill, patience, and intelligence that had protected them. That was the way he preferred it. True security did not need recognition, applause, or validation. It simply needed readiness, discipline, and careful action. Inside his home, he repaired the last remaining signs of the gang's attack. Broken windows were replaced, walls cleaned, and furniture restored. Each action was deliberate, a reflection of the care he applied to every aspect of his life. As he worked, he thought about the future. The neighborhood could thrive again, but vigilance, awareness, and discipline would remain his guiding principles. Peace was not permanent. It was earned and maintained. He allowed himself one final reflection before sleep. The week had tested his patience, his skills, and his resolve. The gang had revealed themselves, but he had turned their arrogance into their own undoing. No reckless confrontation was necessary. Intelligence, observation, and careful planning had ensured success. The neighborhood was safe, his home secure, and his neighbors unaware of the silent protection that had been applied. As he lay down that night, he felt a sense of calm unlike any before. The ordinary life he had built, blended with extraordinary skill, had prevailed. Threats had been neutralized without chaos, and peace had returned. He knew the neighborhood would never forget the lessons, even if they did not understand them. Vigilance, respect, and quiet strength mattered more than loud aggression. And in the quiet of the night, he allowed himself a final thought. The world could be unpredictable, and danger could appear at any moment, but preparation, patience, and discipline always offered control. The gang had underestimated him, and they had paid the price with their own uncertainty. He had restored safety not through fear, but through careful action, intelligence, and quiet authority. The streets grew quiet, shadows stretching across the pavement. He remained alert, prepared, and calm. The neighborhood slept safely, unaware of the extraordinary discipline and skill that protected them. And he, the man who appeared ordinary to all, allowed himself a rare private satisfaction. Peace had been restored, and he had done what was necessary without unnecessary violence or recklessness. Life would continue, quiet and calm, with vigilance always maintained. The ordinary man who walked among his neighbors was anything but ordinary. And though no one might ever know, the neighborhood could live safely because he had quietly ensured it.